Hi, welcome to this overview of the timeline process. In timeline therapy, when we're going through this process, it's really important to establish your timeline. It's really what we base a lot of the processing on. And so in a perfect world, we have a pretty comfortable idea of our timeline. Keep in mind, this is an imaginary timeline. It's not real. It's in our minds. But it's important to be able to really navigate the timeline without having to get into our head. Keep in mind, the timeline therapy process really utilizes the unconscious mind. And as we go through this process, we want to be able to, as much as we can, get out of that thought conscious reality in our heads, So what I want to do today is go over the timeline process and establish what a timeline is, how you may see it, and how we're going to utilize it. So we'll go through a quick PowerPoint presentation to give you an idea of what this process is like and how we'll utilize it. And at the end of that, we'll also go through a short experiential process, I would say, of utilizing your timeline. The more comfortable you can get with your timeline as we're going through this process, the more effective you're going to be at getting to your unconscious mind and really getting to those points in your mind that we're looking to change and to create some neurological disconnect with. So as we go through this, again, this is just informational. It's for you to practice as much as you need to be able to get comfortable with your timeline. But that's the goal. So let's start with the PowerPoint presentation, and after we're done with that, we'll jump into the experiential part. So again, just to kind of overview the timeline, if you think about events throughout time, there's some that are going to be in the future, there's some that are going to be in the past. If you think about right now, that would be your present, right? So something could have happened yesterday, last week, last month, last year, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and 20 years ago, which would lead into your past. Those are specific points in times. And we can think about the same thing in the future, but basically, what we want to think about is a line running through all those events, and that imaginary line will be sort of one of a few different ways for most people. For some people, the past will go behind them, and right now is through them, and then in the future will go out into the front of them. For other people, they see it out in front of them, where to the left maybe is the past, to the right is the future. Interestingly enough, this has a tendency to mimic the way that we read. So in places that read differently than we do, their timeline kind of follows that direction. So anyway, this is just a graphic that kind of gives you an idea of the general idea of the timeline. Now, when we're looking at timeline therapy, what we want to sort of think about is what's happened in the past, really. Okay, so if we think about that, there's going to be a whole bunch of memories that we have. Some of those memories are going to be things that we remember, which would be what we consider to be significant emotional events, and other things are going to be things that we don't remember, which were the points that were hollowed out there that I just took off. So memories are stored two different ways. One is temporally, so in time. The other is in gestalts. So gestalts are like file folders. So if we think about going to the beach, we have a file folder of memories that we have of going to the beach at different times in our past. So that would be what a gestalt is. What we're looking at with the timeline therapy process is really looking at, a gestalt. For example, if you take negative emotion, for example, anger, you're going to have all of these times in the past that you had anger, the feeling of anger, some of which you will remember, some of which you won't. But we're looking at them in that file folder, but also from a time perspective, so temporally. Now, in any case, you have a very first event. Okay, so the idea with this is if we can get back with your unconscious mind to that very first event and disconnect that neurologically, it's sort of like a strand of pearls. So if we can eliminate that very first event, or disconnect that very first event, I should say, then it sort of pulls a string out of all the events after that. So that's the concept of why timeline therapy can really work well for people with negative emotions and limiting beliefs. It sort of disconnects things neurologically, and everything after that is sort of based on that first event. So in a perfect scenario, as we go through this process, what will happen is we'll disconnect that first event, and all those events that are held after that, some being conscious, some unconsciously, held, we'll lose the effect of creating that negative emotion with association to certain anchors that we have. So if we think about the past and the present and the future, and we're looking at the timeline therapy process. So what we're going to do is at least initially, we're going to start it right now. So we're going to float up above our timeline, and we'll practice this in a second. But we're going to float up above our timeline and go back to the past to position 1 when we're looking at negative emotions, at least. When we look at limiting beliefs, it'll be a little bit differently, which I'll talk about in a second. But for this negative emotion elimination, we'll go up over the past to position 1. Now, position 1 is after the event. So we'll be facing toward the past, looking down at the event. Again, keep in mind with that initial event, we likely will not know specifically what it was. We may have things that pop into our head, that we have images or feelings or whatever, but we probably won't remember specifically what that first event is. As we go through the process, our unconscious mind will kind of give us the information that we need. So the first thing we do is float up over our timeline back to position 1 facing the past. Right after position 4, or after that initial event, I'm looking down at the event. Then we'll progress to position number 2, which is directly above the event. At this point, we'll ask, what did you need to learn with this event? What are the learnings that you should have had with this event? Certain things will pop into your head. I mean, sometimes they're sort of random. They may not feel like they're associated with the event, but you have to keep in mind that your brain stores all this in a very specific way. Your unconscious mind stores this information and it holds on to it for some sort of resolution. So, at this point, it's really what pops into your head, what kind of bubbles up from underneath, and we have all kinds of different things that come up. Again, when we bring these up, we want them to be positive. Ideally, we want them to be kind of specific to you, and we want them to really indicate what we need to learn for our future. So, as we go through and we ask about the learnings, we want them to be positive, self-directed, and future-oriented. At this point, what we're going to do, once we've gone through the learnings and we feel like we've kind of established those, and we understand why, what we needed to learn in this event, we're going to progress to position number 3. At this point, we'll turn around in our minds, facing the future and looking down on the event. So this position number 3 really should be well ahead or before any of the chain of events that led to that event. We'll go through this in the process, but we want to make sure that we're well before that initial event and anything that sort of precipitated that event. In this case, we'll ask you where the emotions are now, and most of the time they're not going to be there. If they are still there, there's one of two things that usually we need to look at. One is, is there something else that we needed to learn from that event that we maybe didn't get when we were in position number 2? And so we'll sort of ask that question again. If it really is not going away, those feelings aren't going away, it's likely that this may not be the very first event. We'll kind of re-ask that question, and if there is something that happened maybe before that we realize, then we'll go back and we'll go through the same process again. But once we get to number 3 and there's no feelings there with that negative emotion, again, let's say anger, we'll progress to position number 4 into the event. Looking through your own eyes, we'll see if the emotions are there or if they've disappeared. Again, usually they've disappeared. Sometimes what will come up here is that there will be emotion there, but it won't really be the emotion that we're going through the process with. For example, if we're doing a negative emotion elimination with anger, sometimes people will get into that first event looking through their own eyes. They'll still feel sadness, but they won't feel anger anymore. So that's really what we're looking for, is eliminating the specific emotion that we're talking about or working on at that point in time. So once we establish that, and we are pretty confident that there's that specific negative emotion has been eliminated, we're going to go back to position number 3, and at this point we're going to come back over our timeline, and we're going to look at different events, maybe those significant emotional events that we had an association with anger, and as we come back over the timeline, we want to assume position number 3 with each of those events and preserve the learnings, let go of the emotion, and come all the way back to now. So this can take a little bit of time. It's really at your own pace. But as you're coming back toward now over your timeline, you want to stop in position number 3 at those events that also had some associated, say, anger, again in this case, and let that go. And learn from it, learn whatever the learnings needed to be. Take the time, come all the way back to now. Okay. Limiting decisions are very similar to this. However, with limiting decisions, we're going to go directly into position number 4. Okay. So instead of going 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, we're just going directly into the event. And then we'll go transition to position number 3 like we did with the negative emotion elimination, and then we'll come back over the timeline and notice the differences without that limiting decision that we had decided to have at that point in time, how things would have been different if we wouldn't have had that limiting decision all the way back to now. So once we get back to now, we're going to test and see if the elimination worked, the negative emotion elimination worked. So we'll go back in time to an old event with that old emotion that we used to have, see if we can feel it, or maybe we will find that we can't feel it anymore, which is obviously the ideal situation that we want. We'll also test it into the future, what we call future pacing. And so at this point, I'll have you go out into the future to an unspecified time, which if it had happened in the past, we would have felt inappropriate or unwarranted, let's say anger again in this case. And we'll notice if we can feel the old emotion, or maybe we can't. And then we'll come back to now. So we'll do this with each of the negative emotions, anger, sadness, fear, hurt, and guilt. Sometimes we'll put in other emotions that, for example, anxiety. A lot of times anxiety is something that is felt in this process. However, often once we do the kind of those 5 main negative emotions, the anxiety piece goes away. So that's great if that happens. You know, if not, then we can treat it as a negative emotion. We can go through this process with that as well, and any other feeling that we might have that we want to go through. So with that, let's practice a little bit of the timeline therapy timeline process, just to kind of get you used to the timeline piece. So I want you to find a place that's comfortable for you. Sitting in a chair is great. Put your feet flat on the floor, hands in your lap or wherever is comfortable to you. I want you to close your eyes. It tends to work a little bit better when you close your eyes. With this, go ahead and imagine that you're floating up above that timeline. So however you orient your timeline into your head, as you float up above it, you're going to actually move away. It's almost like the ground moving away beneath you. So as you move up higher into the sky, I want you to turn around and face toward the past. So you're still right above your timeline, but you're facing toward the past. So the further away, the further it is into your past. So what I want you to do is actually just float down over the timeline. Let's pick a number. Let's say 5 years ago. So pick an event in your mind. You're going to go out 5 years into your past. As you float out and get to that space, I want you to stop right above that. And notice where you're at. Notice if you look down that you can see the event. It's not necessarily really clear. It doesn't mean you feel anything associated with the event, but you can notice that there was an event there and you know what it is. Okay. So now what I want you to do is I want you to turn back toward now and notice from that event, looking forward, you're looking all the way into the present time as well into the future on that timeline. So from here, let's go ahead and float forward, okay, over to now. When you get above right now, just go ahead and stop for a second. Notice where you are. You're still facing toward your future. Okay. If you look behind you, you can see down toward your past. If you look right below you, you're actually looking into the room maybe that you're sitting in right now. Okay. Let's go ahead and float into the future. Let's take an unspecified time, maybe a year. We're going to go out into the future. Okay. So as you go out into the future, above that unspecified year mark, not necessarily with any specific event or anything else happening at this point, I want you to turn around and face toward now again. So your future in this case is behind you. Your past is actually in front of you at this point, if that makes sense. So we're looking back toward now. Okay, so go ahead and float back toward now. Okay, you're still above your timeline. Going to stop when you're above now, and what I want you to do is go higher in the sky. Go way up above your timeline. So if you're looking down at your timeline, it's actually getting shorter. Go so high that your timeline shrinks down to about 1 inch long. Okay, notice that the further away you get with your timeline, the less emotion is involved with that. Okay, so even though you can see your entire timeline from where you're at right now, there's not any, if any, emotion really associated with it because you're so far away from it. I use the example of looking at a tornado. So if I'm right next to a tornado, there's going to be a lot of emotion there with that. If I move 10 miles away, I might still be able to see it, but I won't necessarily feel the emotion with it. So that's what we're working with our timeline. So now what I want you to do is float back down toward your timeline to that original spot that you were at. Notice how your timeline is increasing both in the future and in the past direction. Go ahead and stop and float for a second right in that spot that we started with. Okay, again, right above now. And slowly I want you to float back into now, back into the room, and go ahead and open your eyes. So I want you to play with this process of utilizing your timeline, going back and forth with traveling into your future, traveling into your past. We're going to use both of those with some of this process. Okay, and again, it's just an imaginary timeline. It's in your mind. It's the vision that you have, and there's different ways people work with this. Sometimes people will their timeline will come forward or go out the front. Sometimes it's left to right, like I had said. It's just different for everybody. I had a client where his past was behind him and his future went off up into the left corner. It's fine. It just is a different way to think about it. So play with yours. Try it both ways. Maybe if your timeline is your past is behind you, your future is in front of you, you can actually change it to where your past is to your left and your future is to your right. You can play with different orientations with your timeline. But use that as we go through this process. We're gonna utilize all of this more and more, both for negative emotion elimination, for limiting belief elimination, as well as future focused planning. So for goals that we have, we want to put those in our unconscious mind as well, and we want to use those for on the timeline, using the future side of the timeline. So keep practicing. If you have questions, let me know. This is great. We're gonna do a lot of work here that's gonna change a lot of stuff for you. Gonna change your potential. I'm excited for you. So if you have questions, let me know. And other than that, I will talk to you soon. Thanks.